market value. You can think of it as almost being tethered to a certain extent to the market value. And the length of that tether is 30%, or that light blue shaded corridor you see there. So the actuarial value can never be more than 130% of the MVA or less than 70% of it. It has to remain inside of that corridor. So a bit going on that slide. To recap, the actuarial value smooths out the volatility of the market value, and it is that actuarial value that serves as the basis for calculating contribution rates. And it is also the basis for calculating funded status. So a funded status is one of the most tangible ways of assessing the financial health of a pension system. It represents the portion of earned benefits that are covered by current assets. So, for example, a plan with a 100% funded ratio has $1 in assets for each dollar of earned benefits. And such a plan is considered generally to be on target with its financing plan. However, it is important to note that just because a plan may be 100% funded doesn't necessarily mean that it can stop all future contributions. And the reason for that is because this funded ratio is a point-in-time measurement. So it's taken as of a certain date, and it's not taking into account certain things like if a plan is open, the new entrants that'll come into that plan, that'll be earning benefits and things like that in the future. It really is a point-in-time measurement. So that's the background on funded status. Here's what the numbers look like. And what we're showing here is the funded status for all of our pension systems combined. And I'd like to draw your attention to that final row, that funded ratio, the red numbers. And what you see there is that when we conducted this report last year, we had an 86% funded ratio. This year, we have an 89% funded ratio. So the funded ratio did improve from last year's report. If you recall, on one of the prior slides where I was comparing the market value and actuarial value, I said that we sort of defer or save up some of those gains and losses. What you can see in row item C there is that as of our most recent valuation, investment returns have been doing very well. There is $5.2 billion sort of stored up that will be used over the next several years. One final note on this, and that is, again, that we have combined the funded statuses for all plans. However, short of a merger, the assets from one plan cannot be used to pay off the benefits of another plan. The assets aren't transferable like that. And so for that reason, it's also important to look at funded status broken down by plan, which conveniently is what we have in our next slide. Here we show funded status by plan over each of the past 3 years. And in my opinion, there's two important takeaways here. The first is that most plans are near or above 90% funded. The two exceptions there being PERS 1 and TERS 1, but there is a funding policy in place to get those plans back to 100% funded. And then the second takeaway is that on the whole, the funded statuses for these plans have increased year over year for the past 3 years. That concludes my portion, the sort of overview of the valuation. I'll now pass it off to Luke, who has a few additional slides to share.
Thank you, Frank. Yeah, just a few more slides this morning. One item that I wanted to chat with you about is, as Frank shared earlier, we did make an adjustment in this valuation in light of the collective bargaining process that occurred during the summer of 2018 regarding teacher salaries. And this isn't something that we normally do. So the measurement date for this valuation was June 30th of 2018. So the salaries that were bargained during the summer of 2018 were implemented during the 2018-2019 school year. So it occurred after the measurement date. And we don't normally do something like this, but we wanted to be proactive in trying to assess the potential impact of that collective bargaining on teacher salaries. And so we worked with the Department of Retirement Systems to gather some additional data. It was limited in scope because we were doing it during the 2018-19 school year, and so we were only able to gather just a few months worth of pay information. But comparing that year over year, unsurprisingly, the data suggested that total salary growth for teachers in that school year was higher than expected. We are generally focused on kind of an overall average increase to members. We don't apply salary growth by individual. It's much more of a broad-based approach. And so when we looked at all sources of total salary growth, both economic and demographic, we modified our assumption for 1 year to assume the total salary growth for teachers would be approximately 10%. And we made no change to our long-term salary growth assumption for teachers. That compares to about 5% on average is what our kind of baseline or assumed total salary growth is for teachers. And a couple caveats here. Like I said, this is based off of limited data. We're not claiming that this is kind of the end-all be-all of what happened during that collective bargaining process. As we look ahead to the next rate-setting valuation, which is measured as of June 30th of 2019, we'll have more complete salary information at that time. And so we'll see how salaries kind of played out compared to this assumption that we put in place for this valuation. And that data could suggest salary growth was more or less than assumed. But that's the val that's being used to determine contribution rates. And so we'll see how that plays out with the next valuation next year. So looking ahead to that next rate setting val, a couple items that are going to be changing. Per usual, we'll be collecting updated membership data and assets as we normally do, which will include, as I said, more complete salary information for those teachers. And one additional change that we're not expecting to have a significant impact, but it is the first time that we will be reflecting both data and assets for Plan 3 retirees that have purchased a lifetime benefit from the state through their defined contribution portion of their benefit. These are sometimes referred to as the TAP annuities. And so we worked with DRS to include that information in their most recent financial reporting, which is sometimes referred to as the accounting valuations. And because of that work, we don't anticipate there to be a significant impact on the funding side. So the next valuation, the rate setting valuation, we sometimes refer to those as funding valuations because we determine contribution rates and how to fund the plan. We'll also be updating our demographic assumptions per our demographic experience study. You heard a little bit about that last month. We aren't anticipating any changes to the economic assumptions. The Pension Funding Council met last month, did not make any changes to the economic assumptions in that meeting. And since this is a rate-setting val, there will be a full actuarial audit of both the valuation and that demographic experience study. One final plug for our website. We think there's a lot of great information on there. In addition to the full actuarial report that we highlighted for you today, there is a new page that's titled Commentary on Risk. So this page came out of this recent standard of practice that talks about improving communication on pension risk. It's an educational page. There's some crossover with the report on financial condition that I presented on last month. And as I shared last month, communicating pension risk is an evolving space, both within our office and the pension actuarial community. So we will certainly be sharing more on this in the future. But for those interested, we think there's a great educational opportunity there. And also our interactive reports. There, users can calculate funded status and contribution rates using alternate economic assumptions. We are working to make those reports a little bit more dynamic to kind of expand the amount of information available to users that rely on those reports. That's all we had planned. Certainly happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Questions? Okay, I have a question that I partially have answered for myself, but would benefit from talking about a little bit. I was going to ask what percentage of the overall unfunded liability is the PERS and TERS 1 liability, but the appendix here I think helped me answer that. So it looks like we're at about $7,932,000,000 in UAL for plans 1 and for PERS 1 and TERS 1, about $5,624,000,000 for the remainder of the plans that have a liability, and then if you discount the surplus from left 1 and 2, which is about $2,350,000,000. So by my sort of rough math, it looks like about 60 or 65% of the UAL is PERS 1 and TERS 1. Does that sort of comport with your?
All right.
So I guess I know that we have a policy in place to pay down the unfunded liability for PERS 1 and PERS 2, and I know that being at 90% funding for the other plans, say PERS 2 and 3, doesn't mean that they're in bad shape. But I guess what is a practical consequence for us as policymakers, the fact that plans 2 and 3 are about 90% funded versus 100% funded? Does that mean that future legislatures will have to increase contribution rates, or is 90% just okay?
Yeah, there's no kind of set funded ratio that the community, the actual community has said, hey, this is what you need to target to have a quote unquote healthy plan. So our funding policy will kind of drive these plans, and I'm talking like about PERS 2, 3, one of the open plans. The funding policy is going to kind of drive the plan back towards 100%. And so that's a policy that's currently in place. And then there's a separate funding policy to address the plans 1, where employers will pay an additional rate to also get that back to 100% funded. But that's where it's a little, it's not a perfect black box, perfect box to say this is where you need to be to feel comfortable. Because beyond that, there's budgeting considerations, and so that's partly what that report on financial condition that I shared last month is trying to address. So that when you think about plan health, it's not just the funded ratio that's the end all be all. It's a much broader perspective that you need to look at. So
I am curious in looking at the historic funded rate. Well, I guess first of all, the UAL for plans 1, for TERS 1 and PERS 1, that the additional contributions that employers make to pay down that only goes away when the funded ratio actually hits 100% for those plans?
Yeah, we're projecting that to occur in the late 2020s. At that point in time, all members of the plans 1 will have retired, and so it'll turn off under the current funding policy once that 100% funded ratio occurs.
So once you no longer have any active employees in a plan, you really do want to be at 100%. Would that be a fair characterization?
At a little actuarial speak, but yeah, at that point in time, all benefits have been earned, and so if you have assets that are equal to your liability at that point, 100% funded. Then, assuming those assets continue to earn your assumed rate of return, which right now is 7.5%, you will have enough money on hand to pay for those earned benefits.
Okay. My other question is just looking at the historical funded ratio for PERS 1 and TERS 1. What accounts for the dip in the funding ratios between 2014 and 2017. It looks like for both plans, the funded ratio went down in 15 and 16 compared to where it was in 14. we had the policy already in place to pay down the UAAL in those years. So with that in place, why did the funded ratios drop in 15 and 16?
Sure, and you'll kind of notice that trend almost across the board. And a big part of that is, I'm forgetting the year now, but I think starting with the contribution rates for 2015 was when we first started to phase in this longer lifespan assumption. And so the liability numbers included the full impact of that change in the longer lifespan assumption. However, the legislature phased in those costs over 6 years. And so you can kind of look at 2015, 2016 as a slight period of underfunding. And we're still kind of phasing those costs in now. I think with 2019, we're finally at that final step of phasing that in. But for all of these years, there's a little bit of underfunding going on underneath that.
Because of the phase-in of the mortality rate.
Exactly.
Assumption. I see. Thank you. Any other questions? Okay. Thank you both very much.
Thank you.
We'll move on to agenda item number 4, which is an update from the Department of Retirement Systems and our director, Tracy Guerin.
Good afternoon, or good morning.
Welcome, Director
Mr.
Guerin.
Chairman, members of the committee. For the record, I am Tracy Guerin, the Director of Department of Retirement Systems, and I'm here today to provide you with our annual report of all the good things that the team out in Tumwater is doing on behalf of our members and participants. Got ahead of me a little bit. We're missing one. So in the back of your packet, I think you have benefits by county. We provide this every year. On the back side is benefits by legislative district. And as you recall, about 88% of all of our pension payouts stay in Washington State to help our economy. So we're pretty proud of that fact. This is not in the order it was supposed to be. Okay, so the first thing I want to talk about is the number of plan members we have, which is a little bit over 810,000. About 65% of those are active. We have over 1,300 employers. That's state, higher education, counties, most cities, and local districts. We have about $126 billion in retirement funds and trust that the Washington State Investment Board manages. And then we have about $5 billion in contributions and about $4.5 billion going out in benefits. Now, the thing to remember here is that's about 78% of all of our, each dollar that we send out in a benefit is actually investment income. And so what we do at the State Investment Board is really important to keep our plans healthy. So as Mark mentioned, in September, DRS remains a low-cost, high-service entity. And we do that by providing cost-effective operations, and we talk to you a lot about that when we go for legislative asks in the budget, and we get them granted by Director Schumacher at OFM in the governor's office, and then finally the legislature. And you did a lot of those things for us last year that we'll talk about a little bit later in the presentation. We also provide responsive service at that low cost to our members. So just a little bit of what we did in 2018. We provided, we had contacts with 24,500 customers through the web, phone calls, and we had about 7,700 people actually walk in our facility in Tumwater. We retired about 13,000 people in 2018, which was a record high for us. And we provided 25,000 estimates for people thinking about retiring and also recalculations, so relooking at what their retirement benefit would be. We continue to grow participation in deferred compensation. We right now have about 36,000 state participants and 18,000 local participants. So what we're really doing here is looking at how can we have more participation in DCP, because we know that improves people's retirement outcomes. We've seen that time and time again. We've had partners at BlackRock model that for us, and it really does make a difference, especially if we are looking at not having Social Security. So some of the things we're looking at is auto escalation, and then also looking at those members who were not auto enrolled, so people who joined public service prior to 2017 January, actually auto enrolling those that are in state service and higher education. So that's something that we'll look at maybe with this committee next year. As I talked to you last year, we want to make sure our customers' data is safeguarded. We hold a lot of data. So I said over 800,000 participants. Think of all that information we have in our systems. So this last biennial cycle, we were actually granted funding to hire a full-time Chief Information Security Officer. Now, don't worry, we had one before, but he wasn't full-time. We really need to dedicate a lot of attention to this. As you know, everybody's getting hacked. I think it was Oklahoma had the retirement system hacked, and so all of that data is out. We don't want that to happen here. We've had instances of individual people getting their data shared as a result of their actions, and they've actually accessed the retirement account, and in a couple of cases drained them. We want to make sure that that is not something that happens across our systems. We pay particular attention to this. So we do a lot of work around increasing the experience that you have, increasing the complexity of the experience you have signing into the Department of Retirement Systems. So this year, in probably November, you'll get a postcard from us saying, guess what, we're going to make it a little bit harder for you to sign into your account. We're going multi-factor authentication. So much like any other financial institution, you're going to get a text code or an email saying, here's your special code that you need to put in, or you have to answer a special question in order to get into your account to prevent all those people who want to get to your money. So be looking for that in November. We also do internal phishing, which is send something that looks like it came from me, for example, to the agency and try to get people to click on it. We have a very low click rate on that. Our team members are very aware that people are trying to get into our system somehow. But I made the mistake of doing it a couple months ago. So you know we're moving into a new building, or not into a new building, but remodeling our building. So our security team actually sent out a letter that looked like it came from DES, from Director Liu, saying that they were going to start charging us for parking. We don't pay for parking in Tumwater right now. And I'm like, what the heck? Why hasn't Chris called me and told me this was going to happen? So I click it. As soon as I clicked it, I was like, oh, I know they're phishing me, but it was too late, right? Like I was one of the numbers, and I was horrified. So I call our CIO and go, oh, I have to admit, I opened this. She goes, I'm glad you told me because I was just about to open it. But it was, it was one of those, has a financial impact, has an emotional impact, and so you click on those, and that's what the scammers are trying to get you to do, is click on those ones that have that high emotional content. So I was guilty of it, and I tell you, I keep sending everything to the security team now. Is this a fish? Is this a fish? I'm driving.